what's special about today's colloquium is that this is also the first colloquium we are organizing together with the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. So I hope this is going to be a beginning of more collaboration in the future. So let me just introduce Professor Lee, Lee, the Department Chair of Science and Civil and Environmental Engineering.
Thank you, Ms. Lim. My name is Lee. I'm the head of Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. It's an honor for us to co-host the first colloquium. So hopefully you can enjoy for the 1.5 hour seminar from Professor Simon Joss. And, how many of you are from the civil? Raise your hand. Not that many, okay. So at the end of this seminar, please give him some questions, comments. Okay, thank you so much for participating in this event.
Okay, now let me introduce our first speaker of colloquium, Professor Simon Joss. The last name is very hard to pronounce because you maybe get confused. You get confused with the famous movie. Which is totally different. Joss. Okay. Simon Joss, Professor Joss is the head of the Governance and Sustainability Program at the University of Westminster in the UK. And he's now working together with some Thomas, but an international initiative called the International Eco-Cities Initiative. And he did a PhD in Science and Technology Studies, focusing on technology assessment. And his research includes science technology studies, government theory, and the movement of the eco-city equation. He visited the Tokyo City yesterday and had a lot of comments about that, and we discussed that before coming here. And he's also planning to visit the central city tomorrow. And he's very deeply interested in how science and technology are manifest in these city projects. And today he's going to give a talk on this Chinese city, and the title is very fascinating, the Eco-City as our technology. So I hope you enjoy the talk, and let's welcome him with a good big applause.
Thank you so much, and welcome to you all. It's a great pleasure and honor to visit KAIST for the first time, in fact to visit Seoul and Korea for the first time. I had an opportunity to visit your competitor institution, Seoul National University, yesterday morning, which was an interesting, worthwhile experience as well. And so I'm really pleased to have made the journey down to Daejeon and to be with you this evening at KAIST. And if I have one minor apology, then it's that it appears that I've brought the English weather with me. And I understand you had about a month of beautiful weather and sunshine, and 4 days today it has to rain. Well, there we go. At least it keeps us indoors and focused on the seminar. Okay. An eco-city is an ecologically healthy city. No such city exists. Thus opened by now seminal famous work by an American author and academic, Richard Fletcher. The book on Eco-City Berkeley Initiative published in the mid-1980s. Now, since that publication, seminal publication, a lot has been happening, and in fact, we've seen a whole wave of new eco-city initiatives take off, mainly here in Asia, but also in other parts of the world, Europe and in the Americas. So I'm interested in this phenomenon of the eco-cities. Dr. So-Young Kim mentioned that I'm part of an international initiative focusing on these more contemporary eco-city initiatives. We want to understand them using a comparative perspective, looking at different country experiences, and then also addressing them from a point of view in particular of innovation. And that's what I'd like to do in the talk today, by focusing on one particular brand new city being built as we speak to the southeast of Beijing, in a city called Tangshan, Qiufeidian. But before I go into this particular case study, perhaps I should give you a little bit of background information about myself and about the research that I'm engaged in. I mentioned already that I'm part of this joint venture between Johns Hopkins University, the Smithsonian Institution, and ourselves at the University of Westminster. And our initiative aims to, as I already implied, carry out analysis and research into the current global phenomenon of cities, and we bring two particular interests to bear on this recent phenomenon. One is the issue of governance. What kind of decision-making structures and processes and dynamics are involved in these recent eco-city initiatives? And secondly, related to that, we're interested in analysing and understanding the innovation processes driving these eco-city initiatives. Innovation both from a social as well as from a technological perspective. We're also engaged, as the institutions listed here indicate, in bridging the world of research with that of policy. We're involved with a number of policy organizations in considering some of the policy implications of our research. And lastly, we're engaged in hosting seminars and conferences both at national and international level. In fact, we hosted our 5th international conference only last June at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and the entire conference focused on the Asian experience of eco-cities. We've also been fortunate to have been given some funding from a number of organisations, which I should like to mention here, notably the Urban Foundation and the UK's Economic and Social Research Council, and it's partly this funding which has driven our research, hence my acknowledging them. And we're also very fortunate to have had a number of key institutions from across the world join our initiative, the institutions listed here. Now, just very briefly, what I'm going to talk about in my presentation. First of all, I'll give you a broad introduction to the phenomenon of eco-cities, and I'll try to define what we mean by eco-cities. And then I will outline the theoretical and analytical framework that we've used, my colleague Joss2011, the co-author of this paper, and I have used in analysing this particular case of Tangshan Qiufeidian. And the analysis will then, using the perspective of a techno-city, which I shall explore in some detail, the analysis will focus on 4 interrelated dimensions of the techno-city, looking at the eco-city and its surrounding area, its hinterland, looking at the function of science within the eco-city planning, then addressing the international dimension of the eco-city, the lure of the future, and finally addressing the issue about what kind of future community is going to be engineered or is going to be built through this particular eco-city. And then I'll try to draw together some conclusions, and hopefully that will elicit some comments, suggestions and questions from you. So before I introduce the case study of Tangshan Qiufeidian, I should probably very briefly give you an overview of the current global situation. And I'm using here 3 examples simply to illustrate the breadth of the current development of eco-cities, ranging on one end of the spectrum from entirely new cities being built, and the example I'm listing here is the one we're going to hear about in more detail at the moment. Vast, large new cities being constructed, in this case one which is 75 square kilometers large, built entirely from scratch. So at one end of the spectrum you've got these entirely new cities being built. At the other end of the spectrum you've got urban sustainability initiatives taking place within existing cities, the so-called retrofitting of the existing infrastructure, the existing buildings, the existing public services such as transport, energy distribution and so on. And in between we've got a third category which is so-called infill projects which represent cities where new districts, where new neighbourhoods are being added in a particular sustainable way. And the example I'm using here is one from California. It's called Sonoma Mountain Village, which is being built to the north of San Francisco. Now, we can already see the kind of diversity of these initiatives, not just in terms of scale and in terms of key approaches from new build to retrofit, but we can also see diversity and differences in terms of the key actors involved, the funding methods used to bring about these eco-cities, and the particular technology focus used to articulate particular urban sustainability. So if we take all of the initiatives in total, in our own analysis of the current situation globally, we managed to identify 173 cities that use the explicit tag of eco-city in order to promote themselves and to bring about innovation and change. Now, what is interesting about this is not just the absolute number of 173, but also to consider it in a historical context. A similar study was carried out in 1998, which at the time found 4 eco-city projects worldwide. So between 1998 and 2011, what we seem to see is a pretty impressive increase in the number of eco-city initiatives. But it's not only the increase in itself, it's also the fact that it's become a truly global phenomenon. And in particular, we've seen the growth in eco-city projects across Asia and Australasia, and the country leading, perhaps not surprisingly given its sizes, China with currently 24 eco-cities being constructed. Japan has a national program including 16 eco-cities. India is in the process of both using existing as well as new cities to promote eco-city innovation. And I think in South Korea you have at least 3 or 4 similar eco-city projects on the go. And in fact, on my way to Seoul, I read an interesting OECD report which was published a couple of years ago, which looks at urban sustainability, particularly in the Korean context. And it shows that a number of different ministries, Ministry of the Environment, Ministry of Housing and so on, urban development, are for slightly different reasons interested in promoting such development. So what's interesting here from my perspective, from a sort of a European or Western perspective, is that if I look at the literature of eco-cities of the 1980s and 1990s, the impetus at the time mainly came from the United States and from America. Hence I was opened with the quote from Richard Register's book, which was at the time so seminal in defining this new genre. But what we see now is a shift of activity to Asia and also to other parts of Africa, and I think is fast catching up as well. But it's not just a global phenomenon in terms of the spread and the absolute number of cases in different countries, but what we also find is that there is a great deal of transnational collaboration going on between these cities. So these are not just individual initiatives being developed independently from each other, but very much to the contrary, they're being developed in close cooperation. And one of my projects has been looking at the interconnection between individual initiatives, and it is interesting to see the kind of international engineering consultants, for example, Arab, Sweco and others, being involved in multiple projects across different countries. And you can see both similarities as well as differences in the way these, for example, engineering or architect consultants use their knowledge to implement eco-cities at the local level. At the same time, we also see city-to-city cooperation, and we see international cooperation in the true meaning. For example, last year, in April 2010, the Indian and Japanese government signed an agreement to build 4 new eco-cities in the Mumbai-Delhi industrial corridor with Japanese technology input. At the same time in China and Singapore signed an agreement to build another eco-city in China, Tianjin Binhai International Eco-City, and so on and so forth. So we see both strands of commonality as well as you would expect, given the number of initiatives and diversity. Let me now home in on this particular case study I want to explore in some detail in this talk, Tangshan Tianfeidian. And here again you see the picture which I took precisely a year ago when I first visited the site. And as you can see, very much under construction now. I'll be exploring that a little bit more in the minutes to come. It's a city, as I mentioned, built to the southeast of Beijing, about 120 kilometers away from Beijing towards the Bohai Sea area. It is described as a local initiative of Tangshan City. So there's already an existing city called Tangshan, and Tangshan Tianfeidian is now an additional new city being built by Tangshan itself. It is situated within Hebei province. I mentioned that there is an existing city, Tangshan, this new one being built using the so-called dual-core strategy, which we find in other similar projects as well. And the aim really of Tangshan is to open up to the international market by building a new city very close to the seashore, which will be a port city, very similar to Songdo, for example, which is being promoted as a gateway to international trade and to businesses. Now, I should also mention that this new eco-city being built is part of a new, much larger development zone, like the Indian Free Economic Development Zone. It's called the Tianfeidian or Tianfeidian New Area, which in itself is massive, 1,900 square kilometers. And I'll be exploring the relationship between the city itself and its hinterland in a short while. So the city itself, as I mentioned, is 75 square kilometers large, and it's being entirely built on reclaimed land. And I'll be returning to that in a moment. Work started in 2009, and for me as a European visiting China for the first time last autumn, I was just completely blown away by the speed of development that one can witness. And I believe Korea has in the past undergone similar speedy development, but for a European who is used to much more long-term planning processes and political processes, this is really pretty impressive. And one of the first lines in my research diary I put down on my first visit was that it feels like the Industrial Revolution all over again, a 21st century Industrial Revolution and the Chinese style. Now, work started in 2009, 2010 when we visited. It was already, the horizontal work was already well underway. Vertical developments, buildings already went on. I went back last week and visited again. The first apartments are already completed and people are already living in them. By 2020, the aim is to have 800,000 people living in the city, which will rise up to 1.5 million by 2025. So it's an enormous scale of development. Sustainability features. I just mentioned a few of them. 90% of residents are to be within 500 meters of transport, public transport. So the idea behind it is that a walkable lifestyle should be possible, and therefore the dependency on private transport ought to be reduced. 95% of the energy is to be produced on-site and using renewable energy. I'll be returning to that later on. And it also boasts a complex automated waste recycling system. Again, I'll be briefly returning to that later on. It also boasts a lot of recreational spaces, mainly through a 45 square kilometre wetland space. The 45 square kilometres, by the way, are in addition to the 75 square kilometres of the city itself. Okay, now a little bit of theory, I'm afraid. 2 slides only. But just to explain to you how, as academics visiting, doing field trips, we try to read this eco-city. And we are using a particular conceptual perspective to do so in this particular case because we feel that it is a powerful conceptual perspective to explain the ongoing development process. And the perspective we're using is that of the techno-city. Now, I don't know how many of you have come across this term of techno-city, but it's a concept, a theory, which allows us to focus on the role played by technology in developing, fashioning, and modelling urban developments. And in particular, it allows us to do 3 things. First of all, it allows us to pinpoint, to identify and characterise the forms and functions of urban technology within a city and here within the eco-city. And secondly, in looking at the function of technology within urban developments, particularly considering that these techno-cities and eco-cities are often built around technology and try to incorporate large-scale technological infrastructure and complexes, and at the same time try to reconcile this focus on technology with a vision to bring nature back into the city, hence eco-city. This perspective therefore also allows us to reveal some of the underlying tensions that perhaps necessarily surface in both techno-cities as well as its 21st century manifestation in the eco-city. And finally, it helps us to place current developments in a historical perspective. And maybe history isn't that popular. I'm not a historian myself, but I think it's incredibly important for us to not just look to the future in analysing these eco-city and eco-city claims, but also looking back and learning from the past about how technology has been integrated in urban development and what kind of problems or challenges have arisen. So using that perspective, I now want to develop an analytical framework which is shown here, and I want to identify some key analytical factors or elements that will help us in reading, in analysing Tangshan Qiufei. The first one relates to technology itself. So in Techno-City, or its modern version, the Eco-City, is a purpose-driven invention. These are not cities that come about incrementally. They start with a particular plan, such as, for example, Zhongzhou or Tangshan as well. They try to achieve a particular objective. And they usually, as I mentioned, are developed in conjunction with large technological or industrial projects. And as you will see, this applies to Tangshan Qiufei as well. Now, modern technology plays an important role in the development of these techno-cities or eco-cities, and technology is typically integrated into the built environment, into the infrastructure plans. And there is therefore also a particular focus on scientific methods being applied to develop, plan and implement these cities. So that's the technologist aspect. And then we can look at the built environment, where the emphasis, again, trying to reconcile technology and nature, where the emphasis is on walkable, pedestrian-friendly streets, on neighbourhoods and city centres that have a feel of livability to them. That's an important focus and concept of these techno-cities. And they also tried to separate out the areas of work and the areas of residence, though they ought to be interconnected. And in doing that, you can avoid the kind of detrimental effects that we saw in the industrial and post-industrial technology-focused cities of the past. There's also a focus on open-air recreational areas and green belts. The whole notion of the green belt was partly discussed in relation to the emergence of these techno-cities in the 20th century. Underlying these techno-cities, there is also a particular ideology at work. And in fact, and you probably will have heard of the concept of the garden city, which is an early version, an early manifestation of the techno-city development. Underlying these new planned cities is often a reaction against the detrimental effect of industrialization. So getting away from the industrial city, which is heavily polluted and overcrowded, and trying to render cities more livable once again. So behind them is a modernist reform agenda which tries to reconcile nature, technology and community, and to rebalance the relationship between town, country and industry. And perhaps not surprisingly, in some of the past examples of techno-cities, we see a certain form of techno-nostalgia at work. That on the one hand, there is a focus on modernism, a focus on integrating modern technology in urban development, and at the same time there's a sort of a harking back to a golden era, to an age of innocence of the city, sort of pre-industrial stage. I already mentioned that the historical context is that of the garden city and the earlier forms of company towns coming out of the Industrial Revolution. So let's now apply this, that's enough of theory, let's now apply it to the case study of Tangshan-Tianfeng. I want to do so by highlighting 4 aspects. And the first of it is, as I already alluded to earlier on, the relationship between the city itself and its hinterland. And I think this is actually an incredibly important point to make. If we only focus on the eco-cities in themselves, they might end up performing a pretty good task at being sustainable environmentally, and perhaps even sustainable economically as well as socially. But if we don't at the same time consider the eco-city itself in relation to its surrounding catchment area, its hinterland, then perhaps we're missing a point, particularly in relation to environmental degradation and pressures. Now, I understand this relationship to be a physical relationship, of course, but at the same time I also understand it to be a functional and a technological relationship. So let me explain, and I want to explain it by teasing out pointing out 2 tensions that we see when analysing functionality. The first tension is that there is something of a paradox or discrepancy between what is happening around this new city being built, which is heavy industrial development, ongoing development, and the focus within the city itself, which is focused on smart, new green technology. I mentioned a little while ago that Tangshan is being built as part of a much wider development, which is the Tianfeng new area, 1,900 square kilometers large. Now that is a designated development zone, the purpose of which is to locate heavy industries in the area, most notably coal, with imports mainly from Australia and imports from elsewhere within China. A steel industry, a massive big steel plant. In fact, China's largest steel manufacturer has just relocated its works from near Beijing to this area. Oil refineries, and in fact the picture you see here is one which you can see many pictures around the city itself. Oil wells where oil is being extracted from the ground. And then, of course, the big shipping port, similar to Songdo, which is going to open up this particular area and its development to global trade. Now, it seems to me that there is an obvious tension here, which is the tension that the city itself, which is going to house the people who are going to work in the surrounding industrial zone, is being promoted as this super environmentally friendly city, when in fact the surrounding area is heavily dependent on actually quite traditional, old-fashioned, heavy industries, which in terms of CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions are certainly going to produce a great deal of emissions. And the second tension we found was that in the relationship between the intercity and its hinterland, we found was that actually why is this city being built in the first instance? Because only 15 kilometers from the outskirts of the new city, there is an existing city called Tanhai. And I stayed there. I had to stay there in a hotel because the new city is not ready yet for welcoming visitors. And I asked the planners of Tangshan City why they didn't use the existing nearby city of Tanhai. And instead what they've been doing is building the new city literally into the sea. So it's not only that they're building it from scratch, but they're actually building it into the sea through massive scale land reclamation. And that surely, again, has a toll in terms of the environmental emissions being produced. And in the literature about this new eco-city, there's not a single word about the whole development process and what kind of carbon emission load is going to be produced in its development phase, which, by the way, is going to take between 15 and 20 years altogether. So that's the first kind of tension that we identified in analysing this case study. Moving on and then looking more closely at the eco-city itself, we were struck by the strong focus on science in the eco-city planning processes. And we see that in a number of ways. First and foremost, you see it in the multitude of smart green technology and technology systems being used in the design of the city. So I already mentioned the use of a complex advanced recycling system using underground vacuum pumping systems, so that all the waste will be automatically collected and will be processed within the city's resource management centre. There's also an elaborate indicator system being developed in order to plan and develop the city using 141 indicators, each of which detailing the various environmental sustainability aspects. So from renewable energy targets through to waste collection targets through to integrated transport targets. So actually looking at the plans and looking at the designs, it's pretty impressive. And if they're going to pull it off, then certainly it's going to be something of an advance compared with existing Chinese cities, and I would say compared with other cities the world over in terms of the environmental management systems being used and the technologies being used to support those. But it's also interesting to see the language of a scientifically developed model city being used. So science very much at the centre of the entire development. And in fact, they often make reference to a perfect circular ecosystem model, almost suggesting that the city is an ecosystem in itself and is designed accordingly. And all the time, visiting the site and talking to planners and looking at the models and looking at the literature, the back of my mind I was asking myself, well, what about the place and role of people in the city? And it's interesting how passive people are being conceptualized as simply the users of these good services, residents that will enjoy the city, but no talk at all about how citizens, residents, workers, visitors, tourists will be more actively integrated both in the city, both relating to the development of the city and the eventual city itself. And it really struck me, visiting the Smart City Visitor Centre in Songdo, the strong emphasis of your Ministry of, I think it's Urban Development, on actually focusing on civil society organisations, on citizens being involved in considering and developing new urban and sustainability initiatives. So there seems to be something of a big difference there. And I want to move on and highlight a further aspect of the techno-city within this eco-city, which is the use of technology and the use of the language of modern technology to suggest a future city. And in fact, the literature makes quite explicit claims. It says the 21st century belongs to China. That's sort of the brochure you open in, and quite bold statements. So not only are these new eco-cities designed to bring China into the modern era and to help it achieve the kind of economic growth model that currently dominates Chinese policy and Chinese society, but it also suggests that it's going to be the type of future city for which China will be a world leader. And they make quite explicit claim about this. I'll say that Changzhou is a model eco-city being built, obviously at breakneck speed, and that model will then be used to build lots more eco-cities in China. In fact, one of the deputy ministers of the Ministry of Housing and Urban and Rural Development in China at the conference last week was saying that over the next 20 years, China will have to build a new city every year of the size of New York, just to add new cities, as well as build on existing cities. And they want to use the eco-city model as the way to achieve that, because they recognize that there is a massive urbanization process ongoing, and they can only really properly manage and achieve that by integrating environmental sustainability criteria in order to stand a chance of addressing the issue of greenhouse gas emission reduction. Okay. Now, looking at the design and looking at how technology is used in the creation of forms, what struck us, and I think this picture illustrates it quite nicely, that the city is almost going back to the future. This is very much the kind of imagery that you see in urban planning from the 1930s and 40s. And it's not postmodern. It's very much a modern approach to design, and it is extremely optimistic about the future. Whereas in Europe and in the US, current urban planning is done within the context of both optimism and also pessimism and perhaps realism about what can and what cannot be achieved. So technology very much mobilized in order to hint at a rosy, optimistic future, which is to be built through eco-cities such as this one here. You can also see what is in store, because obviously it hasn't been completed yet. You can also see what is in store by looking at what the chief planning company involved in this particular city, a Swedish engineering group, Sweco, what they think about the future of these kinds of cities. When looking at what they presented at the Shanghai World Expo last year in their exhibit of the spirit of innovation, where very explicitly smart technology is being shown as the way towards greater urban sustainability. And so, for example, in addition to using the label of eco-city, they also use the label of information city. using digital technology in order to manage the waste recycling systems, for example. And I think here in South Korea, you've got a particular term used which I think is ubiquitous city. And I think there was one which is currently being built, but around which there has been some controversy. But that's as far as I found out so far. It's only my second day in South Korea. Right, moving on to the final point I want to make before I reach the conclusion. As someone based in the Department of Politics and International Relations, as someone trained as a political scientist, please forgive me if I do address the issue of community. But even if I weren't a political scientist, even if I were an engineer or an innovation specialist, I think I would have to inevitably address it because Tangshan Chilfagian actually puts people and community and harmony very much at the center of how it promotes itself. In fact, the first core principle driving the entire development is referred to as people first. There's a lot of talk of harmony. Now, I have a little bit of an understanding of the historical cultural context of the meaning of harmony. You've got harmony here in South Korea as well. In Songdo, there's a harmony road. You wouldn't find a harmony road in London or in elsewhere in Europe. So I'm aware of the sort of cultural and historical resonance and context, and yet it is striking how much emphasis is put on building harmonious community. And yet when you look at it, and that's the point I was trying to make a little bit earlier on, there's actually very little talk about how this is going to be achieved. It's almost as if communities, it's almost as if civil society and people, residents, are written out of the equation altogether. And I, for one, would be a little bit concerned, considering that no attention seems to be paid to the issue of how you integrate community into these eco-cities. They're not just technological cities. They eventually will have to be livable cities where people want to be, and people, residents, want to actually engage with the kind of environmental services that are designed for these kind of cities. What's also interesting is that the city is, I think the earlier image clearly showed that the city is being showcased as this international global city. And we were asking the guys, the architects and planners, where's the local Chinese characteristics and traits? And one of the, if the translation was correct, one of the responses we got was, we don't have Chinese characteristics in Hebei province. And that's why we use these international designs. And actually looking at the designs, it could be anywhere. It could be in the United States, it could be in Europe. It's some kind of a futuristic city, but certainly not a particular Chinese city, or so it seems. And so we're a little bit concerned about, whether or not at the end of the day you can engineer community into these cities. And some of you are engineers, I understand. It's interesting to think about how you place people, residents, civil society groups, citizens, workers, tourists in these cities, both in the process of development as well as the eventual cities themselves. And also, by the way, quite interesting, where reference is made to people, where people will happily live and have a healthy lifestyle. So, that's from the conference visitor centre. These are people from Europe, from the US, they're not even Chinese. And so it's a little bit disconcerting to feel this discrepancy between the heavy focus emphasis on harmony and community and people first, and on the other hand, scant evidence of how the planners and decision makers actually think about achieving that in due course. So just very quickly, I want to conclude. Using this technology focus, I think, helps us to critically read these eco-cities and perhaps hear a little bit underneath the surface of what looks so gleamingly new and quite optimistic, and perhaps asking critical questions, as I hope I've been able to do in my presentation, relating to particularly the role of technology. And what I would suggest to you is that where technology needs the urban infrastructure, there necessarily are going to be some tensions, and we need to be aware of these tensions and address them in order to ultimately build better and healthier cities as they claim to do in China and elsewhere. So we see a number of tensions and contradictions, and perhaps that contradiction also arises from the difficulty these new eco-cities have in both relating back to the past, relating to the present, as well as relating to the future. Relating back to the past by somehow claiming to be the inheritance of the garden city concept. Relating to the present by trying to address the particular context and needs, in this case, migration and the rapid urbanization process, and at the same time looking to the future, imagining a kind of optimistic future. And just to close, I want to quote from one of the publications that we came across, and just listen to that. And I think it both demonstrates how heavily influenced these eco-cities are by technology and by science, but it also, I think, suggests how problematic the emphasis on science and technology, if used unquestioningly, can be. So that's a quote from a publication. Xiaofeidian Eco-City is the newest and most beautiful of pictures, painted onto a blank canvas, a brand new city planned, designed and constructed under the guiding ideology of the scientific development concept. Science even being used as an ideology, which I think is interesting in itself. So, as outsiders, my colleague Art Malella from this Australian institution and myself, having written this paper, we're fascinated by this new eco-city. We're fascinated by its vision. We're fascinated by the optimism that is used in order to promote it. And at the same time we ask ourselves, but will it ever be a real city? Or will its promise always lie well out of reach in some indeterminate future? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk, and we're going to have just a quick question and comment and answer. Don't ask the harder questions because we are already
Ask
starting,
hard
so-
questions.
Okay, so feel free to ask any questions.
Well, first, good afternoon. Thanks very much for the talk. And I don't know if this is hard or not, but well, I'm from South America, Chile, and I'm pretty sure I've been living here in Korea for 1 year, and I'm well aware of the cultural differences. So my question is regarding these cultural differences for the places that these cities are being constructed on. Like, what's the role of government, political government, and economics? For instance, it's easy to say that I will put people living really close to the place that they're living, but there's an economical factor, like what happened with the commercial centers? Are they going to be built really close to every neighborhood that will increase the price of living? So I don't know if there's some difference regarding or considering these different cultures from different places in the managing of these other ecosystems or systems in the construction of the new.
I think it probably is a reflection of culture, but it might also be a reflection on particular modes of thinking or predominant paradigms that define how these kind of cities are being planned. I mean, let me go back to one of the opening points, which is that these are all planned cities. And if you compare this example to Zondo, for example, again, this is a planned city with government intervention. with particular aims and objectives attached, and particular estimates about what's going to happen in the future. So, for example, in Zongdo as well, it was originally planned, and it still, I think, is the working model as a city where foreign investors and foreign businesses will locate, because it's so ideally situated within the Asian area between Japan and China. So if you want to set up business in the region, why would you come to Zongdo? It's very close to the airport and all that and so on. But actually, on a tour yesterday afternoon, I was told that so far only the occupancy rate is only 10%, and I believe the current mayor of Seoul had to scale down the project a little bit compared with the previous mayor's ambitions, as a result of so far not that many foreign businesses relocating or locating in Songdo. And then walking around, what was really interesting was that actually you see lots of small Korean businesses and shops opening up shop, which is interesting. So you have a plan, you have an initial statement of intent, you've got a plan, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be the end product. I think Brasilia in Brazil, for example, probably looks and feels different nowadays compared with the original plans. And I think that's a very important point you're making, that these plans may not necessarily translate into the reality once they've been developed.
It was interesting to see that you put the thought into place and rural residents so that the city can go sustainably. And I don't know how, I think this thought is really wonderful, but I don't know how you can make action to this thought, because it's really vague and you have to predict people's behavior and everything. So.
Yeah, I agree. We're talking here about sort of soft infrastructure aspects. And it is a challenge, I know that. And I think that's precisely why there is such a heavy emphasis on hard infrastructure aspects, such as the, down to the single percentage point, such as the recycling rate, such as the mix of renewable energy sources, wind and geothermal and the rest and so on. Perhaps it's also to do with the fact that people behind these developments are mainly engineers and not planners, quite understandably, because the focus at the moment is on getting the horizontal development right, the land reclamation and so on. But as a social scientist, I would respond by saying, okay, maybe it's a challenge, but you don't simply walk away from a challenge. And precisely looking back and looking at the history of some of the planned cities of the past techno cities, some of them were abandoned, some of them were a failure, precisely because issues that you just addressed earlier on of local economic conditions and social conditions weren't properly addressed. So I'd be quite happy if out of the team of 10 decision makers or 10 planners, 9, let's say 8 or 9 were engineers and environmental scientists, but I would say have at least one sociologist or anthropologist placed in the team to think about these issues. And just from a practical point of view, I mean, we were talking with the planners in Tangier last week, and I was saying, why don't you get in touch with local businesses? You want to achieve a new kind of urban sustainability. You want to have all this high-tech, high technology relating, green technologies in. Are you simply going to import all of the technology from the United States and from Korea and from Japan and from Europe? Or actually do you want to import some of it, but some you want to develop yourself? Why don't you involve universities? Why don't you involve local engineering companies in that process? And it seems to me that if you want to bring about innovation, sustainable innovation, economically, politically, technologically, then I think you ought to address some of these issues. I know it's a challenge, but I think it's certainly worthwhile addressing.
When putting this concept of the eco-city to an existing city compared to a completely new build-up city, do you think it's possible to reach the same goal, this goal?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think you're putting the finger on the pulse, because certainly looking at the media reports, there is an assumption, and the assumption is that you build new eco-cities by building entirely new cities. It's almost as if existing cities are a lost cause. It's just too messy, too complicated, and why not just take a desert? Go into the desert and build an entirely new city, Mazda, being heralded as the world's first zero carbon, zero waste city. The first phase already opened last autumn. And of course, for an engineer and for an architect and designer, it's a feast. It's wonderful. Can you imagine if you can, 20 years later, tell your grandkids that, I constructed this. You can almost play God a little. But actually, the important point is that I would argue that the important innovation probably takes place within existing cities. And certainly, from an environmental point of view, we need to address existing cities. But also from an innovation point of view, and that goes back to your point, I think it's really incredibly important to look at what is happening within existing cities. Now, if you go, for example, to a city like Portland, Oregon, in the US, wow, that is really fascinating. How they're working with the universities, how they're working with local businesses, how they're working with technology startup firms, how they're working with the regional government, how they're working with the local government, how they're working with the local councils, involving in the process of building eco-districts. And what that means, that's really when you get to address the different dimensions of sustainability. Because if you take a standard definition of sustainability, it's not just environmental sustainability, but it's also economic and social sustainability. And it's the mixing of these three elements, I think, which really point the way forward to thinking about urban sustainability. There's a second assumption often made, which is that technological innovation takes place in an existing city and within new cities and then flows to the existing cities. I actually think it's probably happening the other way around as well. And I think it would perhaps be interesting to pair up some existing city where retrofitting takes place with new cities being built. I think that would be an interesting twinning. You probably will have heard of the twinning of cities as part of international relations. Now, that might be an interesting experience. If Tangier Cherfadian were to twin with Portland, for example, an exchange program, or even twin with another Chinese city, such as Rizal or Weihai, for example, two existing cities that actually have been quite innovative in driving forward sustainability practices.
Thank you for the presentation. You identified some tensions and contradictions within the project and within the city. What's also interesting to me is that the tension that you are having within yourself regarding your research topics. You're fascinated by the city projects that you have also thinking about it, and it seems to me you gave us more than 100 reasons to be reserved about those projects. And then your observation that very perceptively that the industrial revolution all over again in China. So, which makes me ask, will they end up building something like Manchester in the 19th century? Or can they really pull off what they do? And then you also pointed out there are many international engineering companies involved in the projects. And it also it could be a continuation of all of these modern projects that have gone already. In the past, the Techno-Cities is just Techno-City, just with a new name, new chemical better. So you have given us all the grounds for skepticism. So I'm a little bit split. I mean, I knew nothing about this equity project before today, and so I'm a little bit split whether I should put my efforts to really realizing these equity projects, and whether I should be more cautious and rather trying to identify these key players, their motivations, their benefits and losses and all of that. So, could you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, it's kind of thoughts and reflections that I've been finding myself. I mean, as you mentioned, I've been fascinated by it, and you know, that in itself, I think, being a researcher, that's already enough to motivate me to get up in the morning and go to work. I think the latter option. I mean, obviously, we need to apply a critical look at it critically. I think that's it's really important, and I think it's not just important from an academic perspective in order to do critical analysis, but I think it's also important to help these planners and decision makers to reflect themselves. But I think so we do need to be critical, but I think you sort of presented me with an option, option either you somehow endorse it or embrace it, or perhaps you forget. I think the latter is simply not an option. I think if you look at China, if you look at India, the current migration rate and the urbanization rate is so massive, is at such a large scale, that I think not addressing it is almost a non-option. I think it would just be, staring into the abyss if one were to completely ignore the ambition to render cities, urban spaces more environmentally sustainable. So I think that's not an option. You really have to address it. But I think our function, partly as researchers, is to shine a critical light on some of these developments and urge and encourage these developers to perhaps be a little bit more ambitious and innovative. Having said that, here I am as an academic, sort of comfortably ensconced in my university office and so on, and of course it's easy and that's what one ought to do as an academic, to shine a critical light and stuff. But these guys, they face a massive uphill task or struggle. And that's why I said it, I am fascinated, because I think it's amazing to watch what's happening. I just wish that perhaps a little bit more critical thought went into it. And this was part of my visit as well to China. And at least they said that they wanted to enter international exchanges so that they could learn from experience elsewhere, and that they and so on and so forth. So I certainly wouldn't give up.
Thank you for your talk. And after I listened to your talk, I am so much convinced that EcoCity is not about eco, but it's really about international trade and smart technology. And smart technology is equalized to the meaning of environmentally friendly, which are not so necessarily. Yeah. So then I wonder, because we can just remove the name of EcoCity and change it into, say, international trade city, international business city, smart technology city, then do the tensions and contradictions disappear? Or if eco is still important, even though those strange cities, if there are still some meanings and importance and efforts to make those cities into eco cities, what kinds of other tensions and contradictions will arise?
Okay. You will have come across the term ecological modernization.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, in simple terms, what it postulates that you can achieve economic growth and development whilst at the same time also make services and infrastructure more ecologically sustainable. I think that's what is really driving these ecosystems. You're absolutely right. And I think there is maybe to an extent an element of schizophrenia at work there. On the one hand, they have the ambition to support economic development and growth, both nationally, regionally, as well as internationally. And at the same time, they have the ambition of becoming sustainable cities, hence the use of eco-cities. It's interesting if you go, so ecological modernization, you see it perhaps as something of a contradiction in terms, really, but it's still, I think, the main paradigm at work at the moment. Right. If you go and have a look at the World Bank and its work on sustainable cities, they call it the Eco Square Cities Program. Eco in ecological and eco in economic. So, squaring the circle of growth and more ecology. Now, second part of your question. I think, and that's I think where environmental scientists and where engineers have to come in. What I think we need to do is to pin it down and start to define indicators, start to define what we mean by an eco-city. Now, of course, there's never going to be absolute agreement about it, but we could start by defining maybe a number of eco-city models and actually relating it to particular ecological services and performance. I think, you know, if I look at Tianjin and I compare it with Tianjin, Tianjin aims for 20% recycling rate. Yeah? Tianjin aims for 90%. Huge difference. Both of them call themselves eco-city. So I think we need to have a process of standardization, and that probably has to happen at the national as well as international level. But I think this is only, you know, the eco-city development as a practical development has only really probably happened over the last 6-7 years. It started with Dongtan. That was at the time the big eco-city. Of course, it's gone a little bit silent on that one, which is a warning maybe sign as well. And we've got other ones now coming up, like Chang'an and like Tianjin and like Nasta and so on. But I think we now need to sit down and start to specify what we mean and what we don't mean by eco-cities.
I guess we can just keep going because it's still we have another schedule after this talk. So if you have any more questions, we're going to be here for a while because we're going to those questions. So let's give our thanks again to the people for support.